And I thought I would start by just referring back to something that Kyle Longley said yesterday in a very good roundtable on U.S.-Latin American relations during the Cold War. Kyle was troubled, I think, by what seems to be the lack of attention to the kind of complex local problems and politics and culture during the Cold War era, at least in Latin America. And I think I can say with confidence that that actually has not been the case in terms of scholarship, recent scholarship on Vietnam, that there's been kind of neglect of or absence of work that includes Vietnamese perspectives. In fact, there has been really a recent proliferation, I would say, of scholarship that makes use of Vietnamese sources, first and foremost, but that also includes Vietnamese actors and Vietnamese perspectives. And I also want to say at the start that this literature is, one of the features of it is that it pays attention to the diversity of the Vietnamese population and Vietnamese experiences, and there's no longer a kind of unitary Vietnamese culture or even a binary political view in Vietnam, that the new scholarship or recent scholarship shows us actually how diverse Vietnamese society was and of course still is. There are some marked differences in this recent scholarship with earlier literature by scholars such as David Marr, Jeffrey Race, David Elliott, which also included Vietnamese perspectives. But what we see is that in the last 5 or 10 years, it's not only Southeast Asianists who are looking to Vietnamese sources, but it's also historians of American foreign policy, diplomatic historians, even American political historians who are kind of incorporating these other perspectives into their work. One of the most striking things about the recent literature is that there is a tendency to focus more on non-communists in Vietnam, particularly in South Vietnam, in the Republic of Vietnam. And there's been a special focus on Ngo Dinh Diem, his government, and relations between the United States and the Diem government in the early years of U.S. involvement in Vietnam. But even the literature on the DRV, on the People's Army of Vietnam, on the NLF, the National Liberation Front, complicates our view and our understanding, I think, of communists in Vietnam. Professor Anderson mentioned Robert Brigham's work, but Christopher Gosha has also done some very good work on this issue. Tuong Lu is working on communists in the North, and all of these scholars and others, I think, have done a lot to dispel the myth that it was nationalism first and foremost, which was motivating anti-American or anti-Saigon policies or behavior in Vietnam, both North and South. And of course, as Professor Anderson mentioned, there's also been a lot of recent work done on women and the role of women. I would also mention Sandra Taylor and Karen Turner's work on women in North Vietnam in particular. I'll talk, I think, a little bit more about, I mentioned a few minutes ago that there's been great attention paid to the Diem period, 1954-55 to 1963. And I don't know, maybe Matt will say more about why so much attention to that period. I mean, this is the period on which I focus too, my own work. But in addition to Matt Mazer, Ed Miller, Jessica Chapman, Philip Catton have all done very good work on South Vietnamese U.S. or GVN U.S. relations. They've all argued, and I guess would put myself in this camp, that Ngo Dinh Diem actually operated with much more autonomy than much of the conventional or traditional literature suggested. That Diem had his own, Diem and his brother Ngo Dinh Nhu, and also some of their inner circle of advisors, had their own pretty clearly defined vision of modernization, and that's what a lot of this, I think, boils down to, is a vision for the future of what Vietnam, and in particular the Republic of Vietnam, South Vietnam, would look like. And these scholars and others also argue quite convincingly, I think, that more often than not, or as often as not, Diem and others in South Vietnam actually thwarted American plans and designs and policies and goals, in fact, of U.S. policymakers, instead of serving as kind of good clients or puppets, certainly. At the same time, Diem, of course, had to contend with competing political forces within Vietnam, and also with a very diverse population within South Vietnam. And recent work by Jess Chapman and by Sean McHale discussed the political pressures on Diem as a result of the popularity in some parts of southern Vietnam of these politico-religious sects. Jessica Chapman has a very good work on the so-called sect crisis. And there's been also some literature on the influence and significance of the close to 1 million Northerners who fled south to South Vietnam in 1954 and 1955. I'm currently working on a project, an article on this, but Peter Hansen also has produced some very good work which challenges our entire understanding of why these Northerners left the northern part of the country and what happened once they arrived in the South. Basically, Hansen argues that it was not American propaganda which motivated or drove this exodus, but instead it was concerns mostly having to do with community and priests. Many people chose to follow their local religious leaders, priests, or didn't. And once the Northerners resettled in the South, Hansen shows, and I think my work also will show, that that Diem had very little control, and even his officials out in the field in southern Vietnam had very little control over the way that the resettlement of these Northerners actually happened. David Biggs has written on agricultural development. This is a topic on which I think much more needs to be done, actually both in North and South Vietnam. But David Biggs has recently written about agricultural development in the Mekong Delta area. My book in progress also deals with this issue, largely in terms of the working relationships between American civilian aid workers and Vietnamese on the ground. And I think that the relationships and interactions which become apparent in these kind of studies go very far in helping to explain what actually happened in Vietnam on the ground, especially during this nation-building period. I'm running out of time, but I'll say a few other things. It's curious that I mentioned a few minutes ago that many of the good new scholarship that incorporates Vietnamese sources and perspectives focuses on this earlier period. So far, scholars have not paid as much attention to the post-1965 and especially the post-1968 period. And I'm not exactly sure why. Maybe Matt and David too will say something about this, although Lien Hang Nguyen is working on this. But so far, the emphasis has certainly been on the earlier period and U.S. GBN relations during the Diem period. I want to end by just suggesting something about why this all matters and the significance of this so-called Vietnamization of Vietnam War studies, and also the significance of more attention to kind of bottom-up or ground-level interactions. And I think that not only do these kind of studies open up entirely new lines of inquiry and questions, but they also suggest some different answers, or some additional answers, I guess is a better way of phrasing it, to the why question that David Anderson raised a few minutes ago. And they help to put into context, I think, the pressures that policymakers, both on the American and Vietnamese side, as well as internationally, were the context within which those players were operating, the pressures to which they were responding, and also the information that they were depending on, or in many cases, unfortunately, ignoring in Vietnam. So I think that this trend in the literature is very exciting and opens up all kinds of new avenues for future research as well. I think I'll stop there.